Hello, Ilia. Welcome to the Wax Museum.
Hi, it's good to be here.
It's so good to actually talk with you. I've seen you on TikTok and I love your videos. I even actually told Joey Svensson, I don't know if you know who that is,
Mhm.
but he's got a podcast called The Pastor with No Answers.
Oh, cool.
And I sent him some of your stuff. And so you might end up on that podcast.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Yeah, and he's great. Like seriously, like he's had some pretty big names in like Christianity in there, like John Mark McMillan, like people like
Nice.
that. So,
That's
so
awesome.
I know I'm excited about that for you. Okay. So tell me about yourself. How did you come to making videos on deconstructive criticism? I love the
Uh,
name, by
Thank you. It was
the
a burst of inspiration, I guess. I grew up really conservative in a conservative, non-denominational, evangelical kind of family church, and started deconstructing in college. I went to Wheaton College in Chicago, and that was really the first place, which is a Christian college. It was the first place that I met Christians who weren't necessarily the same as all of the Christians I had ever known.
hmm,
And I saw Christians who were Catholic, and I was always taught that usually didn't go together. Christians who, were pacifists, Christians who didn't have a problem with abortion, Christians, all these things that I had been told there was one way to be a Christian,
right.
and so that was really the beginning of my deconstruction. And that was many, many years ago. And it has kind of been this progressive thing. And back then, like, obviously we didn't have the term deconstruction. It was just, uh, as my mom says, me becoming more liberal.
Hmm.
and and so over the years it's kind of built and built and built, and partly because I studied the Bible more. Like I
Right.
ended up minoring in Bible as a double minor because I just kept loving the classes. I just kept taking more Bible classes, and loved what I was learning. And did as many after college, as many Bible studies and workshops and conferences as I could, and started teaching them and even writing them. And just the more and more I kind of got into that, the more I saw like the things I was taught were like the Christian stances, especially politically, but also socially and stuff like that, were not necessarily, first of all, the only, and some of them were actually the antithesis of the biblical stance.
Hmm.
And so, as that progressed, it obviously separated me more and more from the community that I was in here in rural Alabama, in my, smaller churches and everything. And um, so then when 2020 happened and we had the kind of double whammy of the pandemic and George Floyd, that was really a breaking point for me. We had
Hmm.
tried to make it work, tried to, okay, I don't agree with this, but I stayed because of this, kind of trying to play both sides and like, well, I don't agree with everything, but I'm going to try to fight for change. And the way that our church handled the pandemic was the way that most conservative evangelicals did, which was to downplay it, deny it,
Right.
get back to being in person, no masks as soon as possible. And I have several pre-existing conditions that make me very vulnerable to COVID. And so that felt very personal for me, that they were more interested in that than they were in my actual livelihood. And then of course that summer was when George Floyd was murdered and there were the protests, and the sermon that the pastor did about, how, well, yeah, racism is a sin, but so
Hmm.
is, and the normal equivocation that they do. And
Wow.
that was the last service that we watched online. I was just like, no, we're done.
Hmm.
Um and so like all of that process, I felt more and more isolated, more and more like I didn't have a voice. I didn't have, like, I couldn't, if I said anything, I was just a bad Christian. If I said, hey, I think that racism is systemic and we should really be talking about this in the church, then all of a sudden, well, maybe she doesn't need to be leading ministries if she's going to be this radical and this, leftist and everything. And
Yeah.
so that was what I was always afraid of. And so I felt so silenced. And then towards the end of 2020 in August, I finally got on TikTok. All my friends and family, my sister, everybody were kind of on there and playing around and sending me stuff. And they were sending me these videos of these social justice activists and all these different Black creators
Yeah.
and gay creators and all these different people. And I loved it. And I was like, oh, this isn't just for dances. And so pretty soon after I joined, I started making videos, and that became the first time in so long that I felt like I had a voice, that I had
Hmm.
a platform to be able to say these things that I've been just like ranting to the four walls of my house for years, and to my husband for years,
Oh,
and
so
be
great.
able to, yeah, be able to actually like say the things. And then to my utter amazement, people wanted to hear it. Like I thought,
Yeah.
I'm just going to scream into the void and the void
Yeah.
can just, handle it. And then people were like, no, keep going. And so then that motivated me to put more effort into it and do, more and more and more. And that's where we are now.
That's amazing. Like that. And I think that's a huge thing, is like finding a space where your voice is heard.
Yeah.
Like I know podcasting has been huge for me. And
Mhm.
I mean, I don't have a huge following, but it's a fun thing to do and people do listen. And it's like getting outside of the four walls of a church where they have these like expectations of what you can or cannot say, and having the space to explore stuff like what we're exploring today,
Right.
being a pro-choice Christian.
Mhm.
So yeah, so basically I wanted to have you on to talk about a woman's right to choose. Can you tell me how your position has evolved on that?
Yeah, so I should probably clarify by like my position as like whether or not I'm a Christian has also evolved. I
Oh yeah,
always
yeah.
tell people now that kind of it depends on the day. Like some days I'm more some days I'm more confident in it, and some days I feel like I'm just kind of an agnostic. It's just kind of all up in the air. And
Yeah,
I figure if God is real, he can handle my doubts. And if he can't, then he's not somebody that I want to be involved with. So I
yeah,
just want to put that
absolutely
out there.
can. Yeah. Yeah,
Um
I totally feel the same way. People would be like, "Are you a Christian?" I'm like, "Today I am."
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But yeah, so because I started out very conservative, I started out with a very pro-life, like, we did the Sanctity of Life Sundays in church, and we did
Right,
I even think I went to a rally at one point when I was a kid, at least one. But yeah, so like that was, it was just unequivocal, like there's no reason for it ever.
right.
And that was one of those things that in college I heard people speak with more nuance about for the first
Hmm.
time. And heard and the big turning point for me was 9/11, because I am a pacifist. I have been since childhood.
Hmm.
And the idea of going to war is abhorrent to me. And I could not reconcile how these people who had been so staunchly pro-life, quote unquote, my entire life, all of a sudden were just foaming at the mouth to fight in these wars. And I felt like, there can be more than one life or death issue, maybe, and then of course was also, I'm a teacher. And so I was in the middle of my education classes, and we're talking about educating for social justice, and we're talking about cross-cultural education, and all these things. And I'm learning about the kind of built-in systemic ways that racism is still involved in our education system, and how that affects life and death issues. And all of these things, one after another. There's so many, the death penalty, even environmental things, environmental issues, and how those affect people's livelihoods, life and death. And it really just became apparent to me that if we're going to have any kind of principled stance, it has to be holistic. Like we can't just pick one area that we want to be principled in and then not carry that principle over anywhere. I say all the time that like intellectual inconsistency is the hill I will die on. Like
Hmm.
if you have a stance that is a principled stance, but you only do it selectively when it benefits you, it's not actually a principle. Like that's just you wanting to benefit yourself and using
Yeah,
that principle as some kind of a shield against any kind of criticism.
yeah,
So that's how I started kind of progressing. And for a long time, I still was like, well, I still don't support abortion, but I think that we should do other things to try to make abortion less common. And I
right.
still believe that regardless,
Yeah,
because, there are a lot of things that have been proven to help reduce the number of abortions, like education and birth control and living wages and childcare and support for families. And those things, if people actually cared about reducing the number of abortion, those things would be priority.
yeah,
But I've also then from that gone to a place where I also just think that abortion is a medical decision that needs to be made between medical professionals and patients. And whether or not I think that I would personally do it is one thing, but that does not mean that it should be legislated the way that I think that it should be, um, any more than a variety of other issues that I
yeah,
might personally choose to not, or to do. Like I don't personally do drugs, but I would love for all of them to be legalized, because I think that the criminalization of drugs has led to a lot of the problems that we have with racism in the justice system and stuff like that. Can you take her? This is my puppy. She's getting wiggly. But yeah,
yes. I
so
could hear her a little bit. I'm like,
yeah.
for our audio listeners, that was a puppy, and she is
Yes.
adorable.
Yes, she is adorable.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And you know, when you're talking about all the different things to stop abortion, I always think of like from a men's perspective, it's like, what are we doing, you know, to stop unwanted pregnancies?
Mhm.
And in how many cases are we, you know, coercing, right? And like raising our boys with a better sexual ethic
Yeah.
so that we're not getting in that situation to begin with.
Mhm.
There was an entire article that I read that just basically said 100% of unwanted pregnancies can be prevented if men control their sperm. I
Yeah.
was like, yeah,
Yep.
boy, I got in trouble for posting that. But okay, so it's kind of what's interesting, and I didn't really expect this to fit because my next question really flows nicely, because it's like you're saying, like, basically there's not really a holistic pro-life ethic, but the pro-life ethic has like kind of focused on the unborn. And it's like, how did we get there? How did that become the number one thing that evangelicals cared about?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I've talked a little about, if anybody like has seen my TikToks, this is gonna be boring because it's the same stuff I talked about. But it didn't start out that way.
Yeah.
Roe came down in 1973, the decision, and it was not like a lot of states had kind of anti-abortion legislation, so it was a big deal, but there was not an immediate outcry from especially evangelical Christians. There was from Catholics. It was first and foremost a Catholic issue. They pushed pretty quickly, pretty hard against the lady Nellie Gray, who founded the March for Life. She was a Catholic, and she started that movement. And Sorry. Um, so yeah, so first it was a Catholic issue, but the evangelicals actually supported Roe when it first came down. And there's a whole list. I hope it's okay to recommend books, because boy, do I have books to recommend.
Oh, nuts.
But yeah, the Randall Ballmer's book, I'm trying to blank on it because I'm thinking about it too hard. Bad Faith. It's called Bad Faith.
Okay.
And it is specifically this story. It is short. You can read it in a day, but it is full of quotes and hard evidence. Like, he cites his sources for the support that Roe had from James Dobson, from Christianity Today, from
Right.
a lot of the like, I mean, it's not so surprising maybe that like the United Methodist groups were into, because they still support that kind of thing more, but several of the Baptist speakers and kind of big names at the time said, yeah, I think that we should actually, the Southern Baptist Convention made a motion at their annual convention to like support making sure that women have abortion for mental and physical care of the mother when it's needed.
Right.
And they did that the year after Roe became was handed down. And then they did it at their next meeting. I think it was 2 years later. So it's not like Roe was this instant, everybody call to arms, we've got to fight against abortion. Like,
Right.
at first there was this kind of consensus that like, yeah, it's sometimes needed. It's obviously, we would like to, make it so that it's needed less, but it's gonna happen, and we think that it should be available. And the one that gets me is James Dobson, because I grew up listening to his radio show, and
Right.
if there's one person that you would think came out of the womb screaming about the evils of abortion, it would be James Dobson. But he said that he didn't really think that it was an issue that was in the Bible, and that Christians could feel free to take either stance on it. But then I'm looking for my date, so I want to make sure I get my dates right. In 1976, the Supreme Court handed down another decision against Bob Jones University, because Bob Jones University in South Carolina refused to desegregate.
Right.
And that we had already passed the civil rights laws earlier, and they had been pushing, and so they revoked Bob Jones University's tax exempt status. And Bob Jones was immediately required to pay back taxes for years. It was millions of dollars. It was a lot of money, because they could not be considered tax exempt status if they were not going to follow these regulations. And evangelicals were furious.
Hmm.
That was the birth of the religious right movement. And I say that like in quotes because like people all the time will say, well, religious right has, no, I'm talking about like the capital, the religious right, Jerry Falwell et al.
Right.
Jerry Falwell during the civil rights movement preached about how it was not the job of a pastor to get involved in politics or social issues. It was just his job to preach the gospel. After the Bob Jones decision came down, he preached that he could do none other than to stand up for what was right in America and preach these social issues. And all of a sudden he becomes James Dodd. And this is Jerry Falwell
Wow.
senior, by the way. A lot of
Yeah.
people don't remember that there's a senior, but yes, this is a while ago. But yeah, so that's how this religious right movement started, was around the issue of desegregation, and that's a whole separate podcast. But then what
Yeah.
happened was it became pretty clear that that was not going to be a winning argument. It became kind of out of vogue to be overtly racist anymore. And so when that happened, they started to shift to this other topic that they had tried. And I say they, in the book Bad Faith, he talks about one of the political consultants for the Republicans, like tested all of these different topics to see what would get the base coalesced. And abortion was
Okay.
one of the topics. And it didn't fly. It was not the only one that got everybody up in arms for the first time was desegregation. And once they were together, then they could start to push this new narrative about, well, the actual evil we need to be fighting is now abortion, and some of these other issues. And of course that was also, we're getting into the 80s now. Reagan did not talk about abortion in his big speech at the arena, where he says, I know you can't endorse me because you're a church, but I endorse you, that kind of thing. That's kind of his famous like big speech, but he didn't even mention abortion. But then as things progressed throughout that time, then all of a sudden it pivoted to become this big issue, and we could talk about how Reagan actually had a lot to do with some of the California legislation around birth control and abortion stuff when he was there. But so this is how it became the religious rights pet issue, is because
Yeah.
they knew that they could no longer say like, we're racist. And so they had to pick something that they could still kind of code in racist language. And there is still a lot of coding, racist coding around the discussion of abortion. We see this even with Alito's leaked draft. He has that footnote in there that's kind of Clarence Thomas's pet peeve about that, oh, well, abortion is a eugenics issue. And so we need to make abortion illegal because then Black women will stop having them, and we're saving Black women. Like
Right.
that's coded racial language, this
Hmm.
kind of paternalistic approach to, we know better than Black women how to take care of them. And so that's still there, but they managed to do it in a way that wasn't overtly racist, didn't look so bad to the general public.
It's so interesting. And I don't think you even know this, but I'm Canadian, right?
Oh no, I didn't know.
Yeah, you did know that? Oh, okay. Yeah.
No,
So,
I don't think so.
oh, okay. Well, now you know. Um, and so it's like, so I mean, it's still, I think, really important to delve into this history here, because like as the United States goes, Canada goes, because if we see like a shift in law in the
Yeah,
United States, we may see that shift in Canada too,
for sure.
especially as Canada starts to move right. And it looks like our conservatives are trying to be more conservative.
Yeah.
Old Trump has some influence here, I think.
I mean, we see that nationwide, right? Like Marine Le
Yeah.
Pen, it has, almost won again in France. And, there's England, like there's several, it's not just an American thing, but I think you're right that America is pushing that Overton window farther and farther to the right, where
Yeah.
things that used to seem extreme now seem kind of normal.
Yeah. And I mean, what's interesting too is like extremism breeds extremism. And what I've seen in Canada, we had, I don't know if you knew about the Freedom Convoy. I guess it was pretty
Oh
famous,
yeah.
but
Oh
yeah.
yeah.
And so what the result of that is, like, we saw conservative politicians, some of them starting to align with this, and it was like breaking the law and like having, kind of this like sound torture that was happening in
Yeah.
Ottawa.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because a lot of friends and family who like support the convoy are just like, it was a peaceful protest. It's like they were blockading our borders and they were like noise torturing people. Like I can't see that as peaceful, right? And so these politicians supporting it, and what ended up happening is two of our leftist parties coalesced into a coalition, And now it's like they are going to have a grip on our country for a
Mhm.
while, and we're going very left. And it's
Interesting.
like just extremism on both sides. And we're seeing like a leadership contest on the conservative side. And one of the leading candidates is a lot more conservative than Canadians would normally vote. And I'm like, he might win,
Hmm.
because it's like there's this fear of the left now, which creates, and that's exactly what happened in the United States. And we're kind of repeating that.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because it's like, if we could just like be sane, I don't think, things like this would happen. And I think that's what's happening with Roe versus Wade too, is like everybody's so extreme on it. And it's like, we want everything when it comes to abortion laws, down to like, let's talk about what happens if the baby's born in a botched abortion, which I'm like, can we not get to that point? Like, can we
Right.
back up and
Yeah.
start talking about sexual ethic? But
Right.
anyways, okay. So one of the things that I find interesting that comes up in the abortion debate is like, there's people who are like, actually, the Bible talks um, about induced abortion.
Yeah.
And I know that was something you addressed briefly on TikTok. You didn't
Yeah.
seem totally comfortable on it, but I was like, I'm going to ask the question anyways.
Yeah. I'm not comfortable passing judgment on the Old Testament the more and more that I learn how much of evangelical interpretation of the Old Testament, especially, is coded anti-Semitism.
Hmm.
How much of it has been the foundation for a lot of anti-Semitic teaching and talking. Um, so that's the caveat that I bring, is that like I
Right.
feel like I am not qualified to give a judgment, but I will speak to other people's interpretation of it. And so the passage is in Numbers 5, and it is a very unique and interesting passage. We could do a whole hour-long discussion on just this passage. It's this trial by ordeal. It's the only one in the Old Testament law. It's very unique. This idea of you have to go through this ordeal, and what happens determines the verdict. And the caveat is that the man is jealous of his wife. He thinks that she's had an affair, and so she has to come to the temple. He accuses her. There's this whole thing about like her hair has to be down as a sign of, some people interpret it as a sign of shame, or,
Right.
whatever. There's this whole thing that goes on. And she is made to drink this water that's mixed with dust from the floor of the temple, and then a piece of paper with some writing on it, which that in and of itself is a whole thing, because they write the name of God and then they put it in the water, and the ink is supposed to dissolve. And it's the only time when God allows his name to be erased for a judgment. It's a
Huh.
whole thing.
Wow.
And so she has this water that has dust and like a little bit of ink that has soaked off of paper, and she's supposed to drink this after they give this. There's an offering, and I mean it's a whole deal. She's supposed to drink this, and if she is guilty, if she's had an affair, then something bad will happen to her. Now the language is a little unclear in the Hebrew, and I do not speak Hebrew. I only read like the
Right.
Blue Letter Bible and stuff, which I highly recommend the Blue Letter Bible as an app or website, because it will do really in detailed interpretations. It has links to Strong's Concordance and everything. But there are some interpretations that make it seem like it is a miscarriage. NIV does this. They say her womb will miscarry. They just straight up say it.
Huh.
The literal interpretation, though, is like her thigh will fall off. And so there's a question of like, how euphemistic are we being here, right? Like there's a
Hmm.
lot of times when there's things that are said that you're, back then they would have known exactly what that meant, wink wink nudge nudge, like, but we don't really know. It never explicitly says that she's pregnant is part of the problem. It's not like, oh, she's pregnant and the man thinks that it's not his baby. It's just he suspects her of infidelity. So like I don't know if you follow Dan McClellan on
I
TikTok.
do not.
Oh man, he is one of my favorites. He is has an actual PhD in this.
Okay.
He's a Mormon scholar, and I'm trying to remember what his specialty is, but he has some of the most informative TikToks I've ever seen. And he has a whole section where he talks about this, and he does not think that it is related to pregnancy at all, that this is solely a
Oh,
judgment on the
interesting.
woman, because it never specifically says, but because some of our English translations translate it that way, it has kind of become implied this. But the interesting thing about this passage is that because it's a trial by ordeal, God has to intervene in order for her to be found guilty. The normal result
Right.
of drinking water with dust and ink, a tiny little bit, is not toxic. It's not abortive. It's not anything. Like
Hmm.
she by default, she's going to be found innocent. So there are a lot of scholars and interpreters that think that this is actually a pro-woman law,
Hmm.
because what it does is it gives the man a release and proves him wrong in a way that he can still save face. There's no cost that he has to pay if he's wrong, but there is a blessing for her if she's found innocent. It says that she will conceive and bear a child. And most Hebrew scholars especially take that as a promise, like that this will be a gift to her if she is found innocent. So there is a lot of kind of question about this. That it is actually protecting the woman, instead of just being in a household where somebody suspects you and would probably abuse you, be unkind to you, whatever, like in that situation, there is a way for him to kind of clear his mind and
Hmm.
leave it to God, and then just trust that God is going to tell him if it's true, and then they can go back to their marriage. And by default she's going to be found innocent unless something horrible were to happen. And it doesn't even say when it's going to happen, but most interpreters think that it would be like immediate. So
Hmm.
if she doesn't like fall down dead or hemorrhage or something, there's a little bit of also because it says she will be an outcast, which kind of implies she's not dead. So there's a lot of questions about this passage, but it is not really clearly a recipe for an abortion like you sometimes hear people talk
Yeah.
about.
In fact, my friend Matt Oxley, who's a friend of Joey Svensson, he did a bit on this, and I had seen your TikTok on this, and I was like,
Uh-huh.
should dispute this, but I never got to
Oh,
it.
did he said that it was
He
like
said
an
that it
abortion?
was abortion. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of
So
people do. And I
it's,
get why you would see that. Like I get
yeah.
on the surface,
Yeah.
but that was one of those passages I actually studied quite a lot because I was just like, what is going on here? Like it's so bizarre. There's also textually, it is most likely two separate laws that have been joined together. There are parts that are written differently in the passage and some inconsistencies. There's some like then she does this, but then she does this, which should have already happened. And like, so there's some kind of question. So it reads like, and this happens a lot in the law, it reads like two different laws that were kind of combined over time. Trial by ordeal was not uncommon at the time in other cultures, surrounding
Right.
cultures. And so it is very likely imported from another culture and then kind of worked into this Torah law.
So interesting. Like it's like so you still kind of like you're agnostic sometimes, you're sometimes Christian. And so are you kind of like, I'm not sure exactly what to do about the Bible, but I love studying it. Is that
Yeah.
kind of where you're at? Yeah,
Yeah.
because I'm like, I actually in the last episode that we did, I did with Lisa Congo, I was talking about how there was like this passage that talked about like don't permit a it wasn't the word witch, but it was something like that. Don't permit a sorceress to
To live.
live.
Mhm.
And I was like, why doesn't it say sorcerer? And why are we unaliving people? Right. And, I never really got an answer. I don't need an answer. Like I was just talking about how people want quick answers that explain away things.
Right.
And it's interesting because yours doesn't seem like you're just explaining it away, but I'm like, with a lot of these things, like there's so many problematic things, particularly in the Old Testament,
Yeah.
and like people just want to explain them away. But it's like, I don't know, like sometimes we just have to hold it in tension and just be like,
Yes.
I'm uneasy about
Yes.
this and be okay with being uneasy about it.
Yeah, my default answer is it's complicated. Like
Yeah.
if you want to
Yeah.
try to unpack something from a culture and a time and a place not our own, you have to start with it's complicated. Like you
Yeah.
can't start with face value. I'm going to recommend another book. The book Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes
Yes.
is so good about
I've
this. About
read that.
Oh, have you?
So
Awesome.
great.
Yeah. So, like the idea of like what goes without saying in this culture, what went
Yeah.
without saying in this culture, and what are we assuming from our culture that would never be assumed in that culture. And when you start to unpack that, you realize that like the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles that argument of interpretation, which is how I grew up and was taught,
Yeah.
up until we left our church, that it doesn't work. It does not work. We don't even do literary criticism from 100 years ago that way. Like,
No.
if we study Frankenstein, the first thing we're going to do is study the life of Mary Shelley and, what the culture was like then, why she wrote about what she wrote, like what influenced her. Why would we not do that with this holy text from, thousands of years ago?
Well, exactly. And I mean, so much of the Bible is written through lenses, and it's like, and we want to just like apply it. Well, even like, I even find like, it's like letters that Paul wrote to the Ephesians. And we're like, basically eavesdropping on a conversation and then saying, oh, everything he says applies to us. I'm like, do we need to like restrict, women from speaking in the church due to something we overheard in a conversation? Like, it's
Right.
quite silly.
Right.
I really liked your TikTok you did. This is actually what stimulated this whole conversation. Was actually was a reply to one of my questions.
Yes, it
So
was.
there we go. But it's like you have this really interesting breakdown of how the moral imperative of the mother is similar to the moral imperative of an organ donor. Could you just kind of go through that?
Yeah. So the premise that I start with is that bodily autonomy legally, and we have to remember that the national discussion right now is a legal discussion. Okay, it is
Right.
not a moral discussion. There
Right.
are things that are immoral that are legal, right? That you're
Mhm.
not going to go to jail for. If it is immoral to cheat on your spouse, but it is
Right.
not. You're not going to jail for it, right? Like there are a lot of things that I personally might find immoral that somebody else doesn't,
Mhm.
and that does not influence the legality of those things. It's not supposed to anyway. Sometimes it does. But so legally in America, the right to bodily autonomy is sacrosanct. It is considered basic until recently, considered untouchable. The right to bodily autonomy is just a foundational right. And there have been lots of precedents said about this. But my point was specifically about organ donors, that you cannot be compelled to give an organ, even if it would save somebody's life, even if somebody's life is in danger, even if you were the only compatible person on the planet, you cannot be compelled legally to give that organ to them, even if it
Mhm.
would be no harm to you, even if it would whatever, you can't be compelled to give blood against your will, platelets, anything. Your body is yours to the point where we don't even take it from corpses. Once you're dead, you still can't, we can't take your organs, even if it's a
Right.
perfect match,
Right.
unless you have given prior consent. Okay.
Yeah.
So if we have full legal autonomy over our body in that way, then the whole discussion about when life begins and is a fetus a baby, at what point does it, is mute, because it doesn't matter whether somebody who needs an organ is 10 or 50 or 6 weeks. If we believe that the person who is donating their body to support them has to give consent for that. So, and I have family members who have received organs. So this is very personal for me. I
Yeah.
am a firm believer in organ donation. Um, but you can recognize an adult in organ failure as a person and still recognize that nobody is compelled to give them the organ that they need against their will. And you can transfer that to the idea that if you want to say that a fetus is a person, that you can do that. And morally, you can say, I believe in organ donation and I believe that I should do that because I want to help as many people as I can. Just like you can say, I believe that I need to carry my children to full term. I'm not going to abort. That's not what I believe in. But to legislate that is to basically say that all women must donate their bodies to the support of this fetus, this
Right.
other person, if that's how you want to see it, um, against their will.
Yeah. And I think what's really hitting hard for me right now too is like when you were talking about African American women and the way that they're looked at from legislation. It's kind of similar to me to how Canada has treated their indigenous people, where it's kind of like we're the parents here.
Right,
You're not an adult
right,
almost, right? And I
right,
think like that's kind of what I think of too when we talk about heartbeat bills. It's kind of like, okay, for your own good, we're going to make you listen to the heartbeat because you're not smart enough to understand that this is a human being inside of you. Like, have you really thought about that? Like, is that something that you?
yeah. I think all of that is predicated around the idea that there is a morality. They are superimposing a morality onto this medical decision that is, there is a discussion to be had about the
Yeah.
morality of any issue, right? Like, I'm not saying that there's not a moral issue. I did not choose to abort my children. Like, that was my
Right.
choice. But I'm
Right.
glad that I had the choice, like that nobody forced me to do either way. I wouldn't want somebody to force me to do either of them, to carry a child that I couldn't, or to abort a child I wanted to keep. Like, I value the choice. And the heartbeat bills and all of those other things, it's manipulative, right? It's
Yeah.
designed to try to influence somebody to make a choice that they do not want to make, with the, like you said, with the understanding, it's a paternalistic thing, like with the understanding that like, oh, if they only knew better, they would make a better choice.
Yeah.
And my opinion is that, I'm pretty sure their doctor knows just fine. And informed consent is a thing that we have and is required. And,
Yeah.
legislating things on top of that is honestly just performative. um
So informed consent is like assuming that whoever their practitioner is, they're going to make sure that they thoroughly understand the decision they're making.
right, yeah, you're
Okay.
required to, like, if you're having any procedure done, it has to be explained to you. You have to know what your options are, you have to know the risks, like all the stuff. You usually get like patient papers that say, all the information. But um that's why if there's somebody who maybe doesn't, like a young child, or somebody who's for whatever reason in some kind of legal custody or guardianship or something like that, like the guardian has to make those decisions, because the child or the person who is in that custody is not able to give informed consent. Like,
Right.
so there's this whole thing, like if you have dementia, you might not be able to give informed consent or something like that. Like,
Yeah.
but it's the idea that like if you're making a decision, it is assumed that you are making it with the basic information that you need. And abortion is no different than that. Like, it is a medical procedure that is made for a variety of reasons, and all of them belong in a conversation between the patient and the doctor.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So one last question, unless I think of something else. Um, but how do you feel about pregnancy care centers? Like it's interesting because as a kid growing up, I always thought, oh, this is really cool. It's like this pro-life center. But
Mhm.
then as I've gotten older and I've seen kind of my kids become more progressive, it's like they're like, no, pregnancy care centers, that's messed up, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm like, I was just curious to see what you think of them.
So you're talking about specifically like Christian run or pro-life ones, right?
Yeah, a pro-life pregnancy care center. Yeah, sorry. In Canada, I think it's pretty universal that a
Gotcha.
pregnancy care center is like a secretly Christian organization.
Gotcha.
But
Gotcha.
yeah.
Yeah. We would call that like Save a Life is the
Mhm.
the big one down here.
Okay.
Um, but I asked because you could also maybe call Planned Parenthood a pregnancy care center in some ways, because they do a lot of maternal care, stuff like that. But yeah, so you're talking about the specifically pro-life ones.
Specifically pro-life
Yeah.
pregnancy care
So
centers.
this
Yeah.
again, like I feel like the most important thing is informed consent, right? Like
Right.
if somebody wants that, if somebody wants a pro-life care center where they can receive the counseling and the support that those places offer. I know they do classes, they do, they'll supply diapers and stuff like that, usually with the caveat that you have to attend the classes first and, go through their program. But like, that is a thing that some people want and some people
Yeah.
need. And like, but what I think needs to be very clear is the motivation behind it, right? The informed consent. Like, you need to know when you walk in exactly what their stance is, so that you don't
Yeah.
get bamboozled by thinking that you're going to a place like Planned Parenthood that's going to give you a full range of options, and
Yeah.
in the end up being preached at, or being, manipulated into making one specific choice without having other options. So I think that like there's nothing wrong with having Christian or pro-life centers that do those kind of things, that meet those needs. That there are people who need that, but I think that any attempt to do it in a way that's kind of subterfuge, that kind of tries to hoodwink people into, oh, just come here for an ultrasound, and then
Yeah.
like all of a sudden you're being pressured and guilted into a certain thing or whatever. Like, I think
Yeah.
first of all, that doesn't seem like a very Christian ethic, right? Like the
Yeah.
idea of manipulating somebody into doing what you want without having the heart behind it feels very pharisaical to me.
And
Very
that's
legalistic.
and you see an awful lot of that. Like it's
Yes.
like let's try to manipulate people into following this morality. Like it's a
Yeah.
very works-based religion at that
Yes.
point.
And that's why I have such a problem with like dominionism and the ideas of like, this is a Christian country and we need to get
Yeah.
back to the Christian values and stuff, because like what you're talking about is just legislating Christianity. Like, you want everybody to go through the motions of Christianity, even if they don't believe, which is pretty much the opposite of what Jesus taught. Like,
Right.
very specifically, he was so specific, guys, about like it's the heart on the inside, not the whitewashed tomb on the outside. And what you're doing is trying to legislate a lot of whitewashed tombs. Like, why would you want that? That's not Christianity. That's not freedom of choice. And if Jesus gives us the freedom of choice, who are we to take that away and try to legislate some kind of legalism? Like, feels like we're going backwards.
So do you feel like we've covered everything on abortion, or is there anything else that you
I
think needs
mean,
to
I'm
be
sure that
said?
there's a lot more, I'm sure, but
Yeah.
I think it just comes down to um what actually saves lives. First of all, if, like we said, if you're going to have an ethic of being pro-life, you have to be holistically pro-life. And I've
Yes.
talked about how that applies to things like care for abuse victims. If you're counseling, if your church counsels abuse victims to return to their abuser, you're not pro-life. You're not.
Yeah.
Wearing a mask and getting a vaccine
Yeah.
if you can. Like, if you can't, if you're not willing to protect people like me who are vulnerable to a pandemic, like, you're not pro-life. You're
Yeah.
just, and then it also, affects things like guns. It affects like there's so many different areas where
There's,
if you're going to be
I know.
pro-life, you have to have a consistent ethic, and it's not going to fall into like one specific political party because they have an agenda. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
A
I think
whole
that's the
other
best.
talk I'm working on. I'm trying to get a guest for it. Another TikToker. Sorry, I don't know her name off the top of my head. Is about abortion
Yeah.
because, or sorry, adoption.
Oh
The
yeah.
the other A word, the one that's supposed to be the foolproof
Yeah.
alternative, and about human trafficking. And so I'm
Mhm.
like, I really want to get into that one because I
Yeah.
think, like, and the fact that, like, really, and we could talk a little bit about this, is like, the fact that, like, people who are adopted feel like they're pawns in this whole thing,
Yeah.
and they're held up as an example, like, look, this person exists.
Right. And that is something that I cannot speak to personally because I was not
Yeah.
adopted, but just on TikTok, I have learned so much about
Mm.
the experience of people who were adopted, and especially transracial adoptions, and
Yeah.
how that is a trauma that they are working through as adults to try to recover from and try to heal from and try to move on from, because number one, there's not enough education for adoptive parents and the community at large, churches and everything, about how to do this in a way that is sensitive to things like adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and trauma informed care and things like that. Like, there's so much more that needs to go into any kind of adoption discussion than what we have, which is mostly money. And that's the number one
Yeah.
thing that goes into an adoption is money. And they do some training and different, but it's not very well regulated.
Yeah.
So some adoption agencies might be really good about it, and some might really
Hmm.
not be. And there's just not much consistency there. So yeah, that is a whole thing about how people say, well, and Alito mentioned this too in the brief. This is Amy Coney Barrett's pet. He like gave everybody like a little shout out in the brief. Like, he listed everybody's little pet projects, and hers is, we need more women to have babies because our quote unquote domestic supply of infants
Yes.
is dwindling. And so,
Yeah.
like, if you just think about that for like 2 seconds, what she's saying is that women who don't want to have children should still be incubators for women who can't have children or want to adopt. And that is horrifying because, again, here we are back to
That's total
or,
Handmaid's Tale, isn't it?
organ
Like, that's what
donation. Yeah.
Handmaid's Tale is.
Yeah. This is organ donation, right? I'm
Yeah.
donating my body to be a surrogate for somebody else against my will. Now, surrogacy
Right.
is a real thing. Like, people do
Yeah.
that and they get paid for it, and they get, taken care of, and their medical bills are paid, but that is something that they volunteer for. Again, it's
Right.
consent. Right. So yeah, it's the adoption issue with abortion is, it's a false dichotomy. Those are
Yeah.
not the two choices for somebody
Yeah.
who doesn't want to have a baby. Like, it's it's really scary because childbirth, pregnancy are lifelong impacts on your
Yeah.
body. And the idea that,
Yeah.
well, you could just, it's just 9 months and then you can get back to your life. Like, that is not, it's not it.
Yeah, and it bothers me so much to hear men talking about it as if, like, oh, they're selfish women that don't want to. And I'm like, you haven't carried a baby. Like, I mean, the whole
That
thing
was
would
such a good
terrify
Ben
me. Like, I don't
Shapiro
want to do any of
impersonation.
this.
That was such a
Well,
good, that was such a good Ben Shapiro impersonation. Um, but yeah, no, you're right. Like, and this is why, like, and I said on one of my videos that, like, I don't say no uterus, no opinion, because there are plenty of people with uteruses who have terrible opinions about this. And white
Right.
women in particular, white conservative Christian women, are at the forefront of a lot of the, anti-abortion legislation. Amy Coney Barrett's right there on the
Yeah.
bench. So it's not that, but it is that there are a lot of men saying a lot of words about things they do not understand and will never experience. And
Yeah.
they're not even bothering to get educated to a baseline, much less respect the fact that there are things that you can't educate yourself into knowing. So
Well,
yeah,
and
that is
that's,
definitely problematic.
and I mean, and that's the thing, right? It's like I can speak from a man's point of view and say this is it, guys. Like, and it's crazy, like the culture that we have, built, between rape culture and like purity culture, and all of it is like so male centric. And it's like just saying like, well, guys have urges, and we got to deal with the fact that guys will always have urges. And I'm like, I don't know. It's like I always think of that down. One of the Madagascar movies where like the lion like starts to
Yeah,
crave
yeah,
meat, and I'm like, and it's like men think like people treat men as if they're like that lion that just has that craving. And it's like the
yep.
reality is we're not animals. We can see a woman walk by in yoga pants and not stare. Like there's a
Yep.
way to be a human being. And it's like, but we've never thought to educate men that way.
Yeah, you've never had to.
I'm
Like, it's
hoping the next generation is better.
me too.
And I think there is, they look quite promising. I'm quite impressed with them. They're little social justice. I shouldn't say warriors because that's the term, right?
Yeah,
But they're very passionate, and they're not going to put up with what previous generations have put up with. So
I hope so. Statistically, it depends on where you look, because if you in the book White Too Long by Robert P. Jones, he talks about that racism is statistically handed down from generation to generation, to the point where you can tell which counties held more enslaved people before
hmm.
the Civil War by the racism index that people in that county have today.
Does it
It's
not
wild.
improve, or is it like
Like adjoining
hmm,
counties that he looks at, and I think it's Mississippi or Louisiana, that the one that had a lot more enslaved people because of more farms and stuff like that, still to this day, the people in that county have higher scores on the racism index than people in the county, one county over, where there were fewer enslaved people. Like,
wow,
it's, that book will blow your mind and make you want to throw it
interesting?
out the window. The other book that I would recommend that talks about this some is well, there's two actually,
Yeah.
but The Political Disciple. I need to, I want to make sure that I'm getting there's two that are similar, and I want to make sure that I'm getting which one right. It's a small book, but it is absolutely life changing. Yeah, it's by Vincent Baycoat, who is a professor at Wheaton. And it talks about how to look at politics from a Christian perspective that is actually biblical. And it's not a book that's like, you need to believe this about this issue, this about this. It's not that. It is about how to approach your decision making on political issues. And he does use abortion as one of the examples, but he doesn't come to a conclusion where he says Christians should believe this. What he says is, he's Black, and so growing up his family were Democrats, as statistically is most likely, and
Right.
he thought all Christians were Democrats for a long time. And then he ends up in white spaces where these white people think that all Christians are Republicans and have never met a Christian Democrat. And so they talk about, and that's one of the issues that comes up, is this pro-life issue. And he talks about how, like I was saying before, like prioritization, like if you have a whole list of life and death issues that are political, and some of them are on one side and some of them are the other side of the ticket, you prioritize which ones do you feel like are the highest priority that you need to vote to protect or support or whatever. And for a lot of the Black community, that's going to be things that are going to affect social justice around issues of racism, around the justice system, around, things like that, versus white Christians who might look at it and say, well, abortion is the number one issue. And I mean, I remember hearing James Dobson say that's the only issue you should vote on, that nothing else matters except for a pro-life stance. So it's a tiny little book, but it goes through and talks about, like, basically that idea of how do you prioritize when there are many issues, instead of just listening to the demagogues who tell you you should vote for this one issue or that one issue or whatever.
Every time James Dobson comes up, I think of like how I have a list of songs, like different ideas for songs that I want to do on my next
Mhm.
album. And I want to do one called Jimmy D, and it's going to be like about him being a folk hero.
Nice.
Hopefully it'll be very like tongue in cheek and people will
Nice.
catch that I'm not like a fan. But
That's funny.
oh
The
my
other book.
God, the whole like
Oh,
thing where he said that woman was checking him out at the stoplight. I just like
I cannot.
classic stuff. It's
Bro,
yeah, it's insane. Yeah,
I did a whole series on parenting books, like Christian parenting books,
yeah,
on TikTok, and the damage that that man has done to
yeah,
generations of
yeah.
people by what he has told parents to do and how he has told families to be and act and everything cannot be overstated. Like, there is so much trauma in the world because of that one man. It's really quite horrifying. He's not the
It's
only
been
one by any means. I
yeah.
did a whole series. It was like each video was a different one, but he's one of the big ones, and it's really disturbing how much he influenced not just one generation but multiple generations to do so much harm.
Well, and it's staggering when you talk to people who are deep into this, like kind of conservative evangelicalism, how much, cognitive dissonance there is. And like
Yeah.
it's just like there's no reasoning.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know how to break through with that. And so I was hoping, by kind of challenging this notion that all Christians are pro life. And it's like, and even the term pro life, it's like you're anti-abortion. Pro-choice, I would
Exactly.
say, is a little more apt because you're not like saying everyone should get an abortion.
Right. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
And so,
Yeah. The other
all
book I
right.
was going to recommend, because I
Uh-huh.
just have to recommend, The Liturgy of Politics by Caitlin Chess. It's
Okay.
relatively new,
Uh-huh.
and it is another really good one that looks at not so much, it's not telling you like you should believe this or whatever, but how do we let our theology influence our politics, and how do we let our politics influence our theology, and what do we do when those things collide? What do we do when they seem to be opposite? Like, it's fantastic. Caitlin Chess is a co-host on the Holy Post podcast with Phil
Oh,
Vischer
I
and
love the
Sky
Holy
Chitani.
Post.
Yeah, yeah. So she's one of the co-hosts on there. She and another lady alternate with Phil and Sky, but so that's how I heard about her. But this book is fantastic, and she is an amazing speaker and author. So it's a good one.
Awesome. Okay, so if any listeners want to get in contact with you, how would they do that, or to see your work? Or
I'm pretty much just on TikTok right now. So
okay,
yeah, deconstructive criticism is my handle. It's just all one word. But yeah, I'm a homeschool mom, so I don't have like a full-time job doing this. This is just my venting, my release.
and it's so much fun. I find it
It's so
delightful
fun.
and very informal, and I don't know how you pack all that information into such a short episode. And so I was like, this is going to be so much fun to like expand on things in a podcast.
Yeah, my mom always told me I talk too fast, and I finally found a way to make it work for me.
I know. When you get going, I'm like, wow, she's talking fast, but I can still understand her. And then you got all those graphics and stuff. I'm just not that good at TikTok. I'm like, I'm just gonna rant for like a minute about something.
Nice.
Um, and then you also have a podcast too, don't you?
I am a rotating panelist on the Christian Feminist podcast. Yeah,
Okay.
but it's not just mine. It's a whole panel of people, and we take turns hosting and then being on the panel for different topics. So yeah, I have done a couple of years of that, and it's really fun. But yeah, I'm not the only one by any means.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been so fun.
Air Smudge.